My friend Jessica, she's a nurse, and for a while, a couple of years ago, she was working the late evening shift, 3 p.m. to 11:30 p.m. at St. Michael's Hospital in a rougher part of Manchester over in the UK, where she was doing a short work exchange. To get to the main bus stop from the hospital after her shift, she had to walk through this long, slightly curved pedestrian underpass. It tunneled beneath a busy ring road, a grim necessity for anyone on foot in that area. It was a pretty unpleasant place, even in broad daylight, damp, poorly lit with those old, flickering fluorescent tubes that cast a sickly, buzzing yellow glow, and the concrete walls were covered in layers and layers of graffiti. Some of it crude, some of it actually quite disturbing if you look too closely. At night, after her shift ended and she was walking through it alone, it was downright terrifying. It was always completely deserted at that hour, and the acoustics were incredibly weird amplified. Every footstep, every drip of water from a leaky seam in the concrete made a strange echoing report, making it sound like someone was always walking just behind you. There were always stories about that underpass, of course. People in the neighborhood called it the Whistler's Passage, or sometimes Jenny Greenteeth thrown after some local bogey woman, because some claimed to hear a faint eerie whistling or what sounded like a woman crying late at night when no one was visibly there. Others said it was a hot spot for muggings, or that someone had supposedly been badly attacked in there years ago and the case never solved. Jess, being a practical sort, tried to ignore the stories, telling herself it was just a concrete tube, unnecessary, unpleasant evil to get to her bus and go home. One cold November night, she was walking through, her footsteps making loud cracks on the damp pavement. The flickering lights seemed even more erratic than usual, casting dancing, distorted shadows that played tricks on her eyes. She was about halfway through, near the deepest, darkest part of the curve where the light was worst, when she heard it, a soft sound, up ahead, seeming to come from just around the bend. It sounded like someone crying, a young woman, maybe, or even a child. Faint, but definitely there. A series of soft, broken sobs. Jess stopped, her heart immediately going out to whoever it was, despite the creepy setting. Even in this unsettling place, her nursing instincts kicked in. Maybe someone was hurt, or scared, or in trouble. Oh. She called out, her voice a little shaky, but trying to sound clear and confident in the echoing tunnel. Is anyone there? Are you okay? The crying stopped instantly. Then, after a beat of heavy silence, a very soft, almost childlike whimper seeming to come. From just around the bend, perhaps from one of the dark, recessed emergency exit alcoves that were usually boarded up with flimsy plywood or filled with trash. Help me, please? I'm lost. The voice was small, reedy. Jess hesitated. Every instinct, every self-preservation alarm bell in her head was screaming at her to be cautious, to turn around and go back, take the long way. This was a creepy, isolated place at nearly midnight, but what if someone genuinely needed help? As a nurse, her first impulse for training was to assist, not to run away. She took a few tentative steps forward, peering cautiously around the curve in the tunnel. The stretch of underpass ahead was empty, or at least it looked empty in the dim, flickering, unreliable light. But the whimpering sound came again, a little closer this time, seeming to emanate directly from that dark, recessed emergency exit alcove, which now saw had its flimsy plywood covering partially kicked in, a dark opening into unknown blackness. I'm here, Jess said, trying to sound calm and reassuring, though her own heart was starting to pound a nervous rhythm against her ribs. Where are you? I can help you. Don't be scared. Then she heard it. Not from the alcove, footsteps behind her. Quick, light, almost stealthy footsteps coming from the direction she just walked, the direction of the hospital exit. She spun around, her breath catching in her throat, a gasp escaping her lips. Nothing. The long stretch of tunnel behind her was empty, vanishing into oppressive gloom. But she knew she'd heard them. Distinctly. More than one set, she thought. A cold, visceral dread started to creep up her spine, making the hairs on her arms stand on end. This felt profoundly wrong. The crying ahead, now the footsteps behind. Was this a trap? One of those horrible classic stories where someone fakes distress to lure a compassionate victim into an ambush? Please. I'm so scared. The whimpering voice came again from the alcove, a little more insistent now, a little less childlike, a little more theatrical, almost mocking. Jess backed away slowly, her eyes darting nervously between the dark alcove ahead and the empty, echoing tunnel behind her. I'm going to get help from the hospital security, she called out, her voice trembling noticeably now, betraying her fear. Just stay right there. Don't move. It was a lie, of course. The hospital was back the way she'd come, past where she thought she'd heard those stealthy footsteps. As she started to backpedal more quickly, ready to turn and run for her life, she heard another sound. A low, guttural chuckle, coming directly from the alcove. Not a child's chuckle. Not the sound of someone in distress. A deep, malevolent, adult chuckle. And then, from behind her, from the direction she absolutely needed to go to escape, she heard the distinct sound of a heavy boot scuffing deliberately on the concrete, followed by another, closer. She was caught in the middle. Boxed in. Panic, pure and undiluted, seized her. She didn't scream. She just turned and ran as fast as her legs could carry her back towards the hospital entrance of the tunnel, away from the chuckling alcove, directly towards the source of that scuffing sound, hoping against hope it was just one person behind her and not more. She could hear heavier footsteps pounding on the concrete behind her now, definitely pursuing her, no longer stealthy, no longer trying to be subtle. And from the alcove, that horrible, knowing chuckling seemed to follow her, amplified, and distorted by the tunnel's strange, echoing acoustics, bouncing off the cold, damp walls like the laughter of demons. She burst out of the underpass into the relative brightness and blessed normalcy of the hospital. Back entrance area, gasping for breath, her lungs burning her heart, feeling like it was going to explode out of her chest. She didn't look back, didn't dare, until she was safely inside the brightly lit hospital lobby, where a sleepy security guard looked up in surprise as she practically collapsed against the reception desk, sobbing. She tried to explain what happened, babbling incoherently at first, about the crying, the footsteps, the chuckle, the terrifying feeling of being trapped, hunted. The guard, once he understood, listened with a poker face, then went to check the underpass with another, more alert-looking colleague. They came back 20 minutes later, their expressions impassive. "Nothing, miss," the first guard said, with a hint of boredom, as if this was a common occurrence. Tunnels completely empty. No sign of anyone down there. Probably just the wind whistling through, or some kids messing around earlier, trying to scare people. You know how sound carries in a place like that. Plays tricks on you. Jess knew it wasn't the wind. She knew it wasn't just kids messing around. The fear had been too real, the malicious intent too palpable. But she had no proof. No one had touched her. No one had overtly threatened her with words until that last, terrifying chase. When she told her friends about it, they were sympathetic, of course. But she could see the doubt lingering in their eyes. "Are you sure it wasn't just echoes, Jess? That place is super creepy." and you were tired after a long shift. Maybe your imagination just got the better of you. She stopped using the underpass, of course. Took the long way around on the surface streets, even though it added a good 15 minutes to her commute and meant crossing that dangerous 6-lane ring road at street level. She never found out who or what was in that tunnel that night, or what they truly wanted. But she's convinced it was a deliberate, malicious attempt to lure her, to trap her. The crying child, or woman in distress, is a classic, horrible ploy used by predators. And the thought that those people, whoever they were, might still be using that underpass, waiting for another unsuspecting, compassionate victim. It still makes her sick to her stomach. It taught her that sometimes the most dangerous traps are the ones that play on your best instincts, your desire to help. And that the echoes in a dark, lonely tunnel might be something far more sinister, far more human than just sound bouncing off concrete walls. And the fact that no one truly believes the full extent of your terror just adds another layer to the chilling isolation of the experience. My friend Lara and her boyfriend at the time, Ben, were these hardcore hikers, you know? The kind who are always looking for new, challenging trails. The ones that weren't in the glossy tourist brochures or on the well-trodden park maps. The ones that promised a bit of real, raw adventure. They lived out in a pretty rural part of Colorado, up in the mountains near Ouray, an area surrounded by old, defunct silver and gold mining country. There were a lot of abandoned mines and prospecting tunnels dotting the hillsides, most of them dating back to the late 1800s or early 1900s, remnants of a long-gone boom and bust mining era. Most were officially sealed off with heavy steel grates or concrete plugs, or at least supposed to be, for safety reasons, bad air, unstable rock, sudden drops. But there was this one, a passage known locally by a few different names, but often called the Hope End Tunnel, though that wasn't its official designation. Just what some of the old-timers called it. That was a bit of a local legend, a whispered secret among the more adventurous, and perhaps reckless hikers and off-roaders in the area. It supposedly cut straight through a small, steep mountain connecting two remote valleys, and was rumored to knock a good 2 or 3 hours and several hundred feet of brutal elevation gain off a popular but very long and strenuous loop trail. The official Park Service and Forest Service maps didn't show it as a viable route, of course, and they were faded. Rust-riddled, bullet-pock-dangered, unsafe structure do not enter. Risk of death signs near both its known partially collapsed entrances. But the local talk, the kind you overhear in a small-town diner or the dusty general store, was that it was mostly stable. If you were careful and knew what you were doing, and that people used it all the time as a thrilling shortcut. Some of the older, darker stories also mentioned it being unlucky or haunted by the ghosts of miners trapped and killed in a long-ago cave-in, or that it was a place where you could sometimes hear strange echoes that were your own, or feel sudden, inexplicable cold spots even on a hot day. Lara, being a bit of a thrill seeker and a hardened skeptic of ghost stories, was naturally determined to check it out. So, one crisp, bright autumn Saturday, Lara and Ben set off on the long loop trail, specifically planning to take the Hope's End Tunnel shortcut on their way back to save some daylight. They found the southern entrance easily enough, following some vague directions from another hiker they met who claimed to have gone through it just last year. It was a dark, jagged, uninviting hole in the mountainside, partially a thick growth of thorny bushes and a recent rock slide that had narrowed the opening. The danger sign was there, alright, practically illegible from rust and what looked suspiciously like old bullet holes. They had powerful headlamps, extra batteries, plenty of water, helmets, and a shared sense of adventure that, at that moment, but outweighed their caution or any lingering respect for warning signs. The tunnel was rough-hewn, clearly old, the air inside immediately cold and damp, smelling strongly of wet rock, stale earth, and something else. Something faintly metallic and vaguely acrid, like old machinery or perhaps even spent black powder from ancient blasting. Their powerful headlamp beams cut through the oppressive, absolute darkness, revealing dripping, slimy walls covered in strange mineral deposits, loose scree, and treacherous debris underfoot, and ancient, rotting, and often cracked and splintered wooden support timbers. It was definitely creepy, claustrophobic as hell, but also, Lara admitted to me later, kind of exciting in this is probably a really stupid and dangerous idea. But here we are, kind of way. About a quarter of a mile in, where the darkness was absolute and the only sound was the constant, echoing drip of water from the unseen ceiling and the crunch of their own heavy hiking boots on the uneven, rocky floor. Ben, who was leading the way, suddenly stopped, holding up a hand to halt Laura. Whoa, hang on a second. Check this out, Laura. This is new. His headlamp beam was fixed on the tunnel wall just ahead. Someone had recently, very recently, scratched a series of strange, angular symbols into the rock face. Fresh white marks against the dark, damp stone, clearly made with a sharp piece of quartz or a knife. They weren't old mining survey marks or random teenage graffiti. They looked almost like warnings or some kind of crude directional symbols, but not for any known trail or language they recognized. And there were relatively fresh footprints in the dusty, otherwise undisturbed floor of the tunnel. Heavy work boot prints, not hiking boots. Heading deeper in, not just the occasional curious explorer's tracks they might have half expected to find. A little further on, maybe another 100 yards, they found more. A discarded, crumpled energy bar wrapper, not an old, faded, sun-bleached one, but still relatively new, tucked into a rock crevice. A small, neatly coiled length of new-looking, heavy-gauge nylon rope stashed behind a fallen timber, as if hidden there deliberately for later use. And then the air in the tunnel changed. The stale, unmoving, cold air they'd been breathing suddenly had a faint but definite current. A draft, as if another opening, an unknown ventilation shaft or perhaps a side tunnel they hadn't noticed, was nearby, connecting to the surface or another part of the mine. And with that draft came a very faint, almost inaudible rhythmic sound. A sort of clinking or a soft rhythmic hammering or scraping. Distant, but definitely there, carried on the strange new current of air, seeming to come from deeper within the mountain. "Did you hear that?" Laura whispered, her voice tight with a sudden new apprehension, the thrill of adventure rapidly evaporating, replaced by a cold knot of unease. Ben nodded, his face pale and tense in the bouncing, reflected light of their headlamps. "Yeah, I hear it. That doesn't sound like ghosts to me or the mountain settling. That sounds like someone's working or digging." Recently. Working? Digging? In an abandoned, condemned, supposedly forgotten, and officially sealed mining tunnel? This wasn't part of the thrilling shortcut legend. This was something else entirely. Something unexpected and potentially very dangerous. The local stories, the ones that old-timers told in hushed, nervous tones, also sometimes mentioned vague, persistent rumors of illegal wildcat mining still happening in some of the old forgotten tunnels in these hills, people looking for overlooked veins of gold or other valuable minerals operating completely off the books, unlicensed, and known to be fiercely sometimes violently protective of their secret claims. They didn't take kindly to trespassers. They pressed on for a few more yards, moving much more cautiously now, their earlier bravado gone, driven now by a mixture of a terrible, morbid fear and an equally dangerous, foolish curiosity. The clinking, hammering sound got a little louder, more distinct, then abruptly stopped, as if whoever was making it had heard them or sensed their approach. They rounded a sharp, narrow bend in the main tunnel, and their headlamps fell upon a much smaller side passage they hadn't seen on any of the old rudimentary maps of the original mine workings they'd managed to find online. This side passage looked much more recently worked than the main tunnel, the rock face showing fresher, sharper tool marks. The floor clear of ancient debris, with a narrow set of makeshift wooden rails leading into the blackness. And from down this narrow, dark passage, they heard a low, muffled voice, then another, gruff and angry, speaking in a language they didn't recognize, possibly Spanish or something else entirely. An argument, maybe? Lara and Ben froze, their blood turning to ice in their veins. They weren't alone in this mountain. Not by a long shot. And whoever else was here with them clearly wasn't just a fellow hiker looking for a shortcut. They were involved in something serious, something they probably didn't want discovered. Something that required secrecy and the danger of working in the dark, unstable heart of a condemned mine. Suddenly, a much brighter, more powerful, focused light appeared at the far end of that side passage, bobbing erratically as it headed their way, accompanied by the distinct, heavy, purposeful crunch of work boots on gravel. Someone was coming towards them, and quickly. They didn't wait to find out who it was or what they wanted. They turned and ran, scrambling back the way they'd come, their headlamps bouncing crazily, casting wild leaping shadows on the tunnel. Walls stumbling on the loose rocks and uneven floor, their only thought to get out of that suffocating, terrifying tunnel, back into the daylight, back to safety. They could hear shouts behind them now, angry, surprised, guttural voices, definitely more than one person. And the undeniable sound of people, or more than one person, running in pursuit, their heavy boots pounding in the confined, echoing space, gaining on them. They'd burst out of the tunnel entrance into the blessed, bright, beautiful sunlight, gasping for breath, hearts pounding like trapped birds, not stopping until they were well away from the mountainside, back on the main, official, populated trail. They didn't see anyone follow them out of the tunnel. They didn't look back long enough to find out. When they told their story to some other local hikers later that day, down at the trailhead parking lot, trying to catch their breath in the calm, their shredded nerves, the reactions were mixed, mostly skeptical, tinged with a bit of told you so about going into old mines. Oh, that old Hope's End tunnel. Yeah, it's always had weird stories connected to it. Probably just some local kids messing around in there, trying to scare people off their clubhouse. One seasoned, unimpressed hiker said with a dismissive wave of his hand. Another suggested, with a knowing smirk, maybe it was just some other explorers, or some amateur geologists, and you all just startled each other in the dark. Easy to get spooked in a place like that, especially with all the ghost stories. No one seemed to take seriously their absolute conviction that they had stumbled upon an active, illicit, and potentially very dangerous human operation. The park rangers, when Laura cautiously, anonymously, reported suspicious activity and sounds of digging and voices near the old tunnel, said they'd look into it when they had a patrol scheduled in that remote sector, but also sternly warned her again about the very real dangers of entering condemned mines, cave-ins, bad air, getting lost, and yes, sometimes encountering unpredictable individuals. Lara and Ben understandably never use that shortcut again, or any other like it. They never found out for sure who or what was in that tunnel that day, or what they were so desperately trying to hide or find. But the fresh tool marks, the stashed rope, the angry voices, the definite pursuit, it all pointed to something far more real and immediately dangerous than any old miner's ghosts. It was a chilling, stark reminder that some abandoned places aren't abandoned at all, but have been reclaimed by people who operate in the shadows, outside the law, for their own secret, often illicit purposes. And sometimes a tempting shortcut can lead you straight into a situation where you're not welcome, and where your unwelcome discovery could have very serious, very permanent consequences. The thrill was definitely not worth the abject terror they experienced. And the fact that no one really believed the full extent of their danger just made it worse. Made them doubt their own narrow escape from whatever those men in the mountain were really up to. I have always been one for shortcuts, maybe to a fault. Living in a big city like Chicago, time is everything, right? So, when I heard whispers from some urban explorer forums about this disused section of the old Cermak branch of the Blue Line, a stretch of forgotten tunnel near Pilsen that supposedly cut a good 20 minutes off my commute, home from my late night bartending gig if you knew where to slip in and out, I was definitely intrigued. They said it was mostly sealed off, but there was this one access point, an old emergency hatch in a forgotten, trash-strewn alleyway off 18th Street. The stories about it were mixed. Some said it was just dark and dusty, and maybe a few rats. Others mentioned weird echoes, or the unsettling feeling of not being alone down there. You know, the kind of talk that clings to abandoned, creepy places. One frigid January night, I was working super late. Missed the last official train, and was facing an expensive cab ride I couldn't really afford. Or a ridiculously long night bus journey that would get me home around sunrise. That's when I remembered the Cermak branch shortcut. It was risky, probably highly illegal, definitely stupid. But I was tired, broke, and feeling a bit reckless, a bit too confident. Finding the hatch wasn't too hard, just like the forum description said. It was heavy cast iron, rusted nearly solid, but with a bit of effort and a pry bar I borrowed from the bar's utility closet. It creaked open with a groan that echoed in the silent alley. I dropped down into the pitch blackness, my phone flashlight cutting a weak, trembling beam. The air hit me immediately, cold, stale, smelling of damp concrete, rust, old refuse, and something else. Something faintly metallic and deeply unpleasant, like old blood or decay. The silence was immense, almost physical pressure, broken only by the steady dripping of water somewhere in the echoing distance and the crunch of broken glass and debris under my boots. The tunnel stretched out ahead, a dark, gaping, silent maw. I started walking, my footsteps echoing unnervingly, making it sound like someone else was walking with me. It was supposed to be a pretty straight shot, about a mile, then another known access point, a ventilation shaft with missing bars, near my neighborhood in University Village. Easy, right? That's what the forum junkies claimed. Wrong. So wrong. About halfway through, maybe 20 minutes in, I started to feel off. Seriously off. The silence didn't feel empty anymore. It felt watchful, charged. I'd stop, hold my breath, listen. Nothing but the drip and my own heart hammering. Then, as I started walking again, I'd hear it, a faint scuffling sound somewhere behind me. Always just on the edge of hearing, always stopping abruptly when I stopped. My heart started to pound harder. Was it rats? This deep, this far from any known food sources or exits? They have to be massive, bold rats. Then I saw the graffiti. This wasn't the usual colorful tags or artistic murals you see in some accessible urban spaces. This was different. Crude, deeply unsettling symbols chalked on the grimy tunnel walls. Things that looked like twisted. Screamy faces or strange spidery sigils I didn't recognize. And some of it looked disturbingly fresh. Like done within the last few days, the chalk dust still clinging to the damp concrete. And there were footprints in the thick dust on the tunnel floor, not just mine from the way in. Several sets, some heavier work boot prints, some lighter, almost sneaker-like. More people than I was comfortable with knew about this shortcut. My quick and easy shortcut was rapidly starting to feel like a very bad, potentially life-altering idea. I quickened my pace, trying to ignore the growing knot of dread in my stomach. The scuffling sound behind me seemed to get a little closer, a little more distinct, less like rats and more like dragging footsteps. Heavy, deliberate, dragging footsteps. I passed a small arched alcove, probably an old maintenance recess or an emergency exit that had been bricked up decades ago, and I saw it. A makeshift bed. A disgusting pile of filthy, stained blankets and flattened cardboard boxes. And beside it, a few empty food cans, a discarded, cheap-looking, ripped backpack, and a length of heavy, thick rope coiled neatly, almost professionally. Someone was living down here, or at least using this place regularly. And for what purpose with that rope, I didn't want to imagine. And they probably wouldn't appreciate a stranger like me wandering through their subterranean home. The local talk about the old, disused subway line sometimes mentioned homeless encampments. Sure, but also darker, more persistent rumors, gangs using the tunnels for storage of stolen goods, or as hidden escape routes after a job. Or even stories about a tunnel king, a local boogeyman, some said a dangerous recluse, who supposedly ruled these abandoned sections with an iron fist. A figure no one had ever clearly seen, but whose menacing presence was sometimes felt by those foolish enough to venture down. Panic, cold and sharp, started to set in properly now. I wasn't just trespassing anymore. I was an intruder in someone else's potentially dangerous, hidden territory. I started to run, my phone flashlight beam bouncing wildly off the oppressive walls, casting long, distorted, leaping shadows that seemed to writhe and reach out at me from the tunnel walls. The dragging footsteps behind me definitely sped up then, no longer trying to be stealthy or subtle. I could hear them clearly now, heavy, deliberate, gaining on me with an unnerving speed. I didn't dare look back. I just ran, fueled by pure, unadulterated adrenaline and terror. The air was getting thicker, harder to breathe, filled with that metallic, dusty tang. The tunnel seemed to stretch on forever, an endless, lightless tube. Was this even the right way? Had I gotten turned around in the darkness in my panic? The thought was horrifying. Then, up ahead, a faint, almost imperceptible glimmer of light. An exit? Or just another ventilation shaft playing tricks on my desperate eyes? As I got closer, my lungs burning, my legs screaming, I saw it was a rusted metal ladder leading up to what looked like a manhole cover, with a sliver of blessed, beautiful streetlight filtering through a tiny crack. Hope surged through me, giving me a last burst of energy. I scrambled up the slippery, rusted ladder, my hands raw and bleeding. I pushed at the heavy manhole cover. It was incredibly heavy, stuck fast with rust and grime. I could hear those footsteps getting closer, almost right below me now, accompanied by a low, guttural breathing sound. With a final, desperate, superhuman heave, the cover shifted with a grating screech. I squeezed through the narrow opening, out onto a blessedly normal, if deserted. City street, gasping for air, the cool night rain on my face feeling like a baptism. I didn't look back down the manhole. I just ran, not stopping until I was in a well-lit area, until I could see other people, other cars, signs of normal life. When I finally got home, shaking like a leaf and filthy from head to toe, I told my roommate what happened. He just stared at me, his mouth open. Are you completely insane? You went into the abandoned blue line tunnels alone in the middle of the night? Dude, you're lucky you didn't get mugged or stabbed or worse. Those footsteps? Probably just some homeless guy you spooked, or maybe some other urban explorers who thought you were the threat. You probably imagined half of it in the dark. Man, maybe he was right. Maybe it was just a homeless person and had simply overreacted to the creepy environment. Maybe the graffiti was just random scribbles. But the feeling of being hunted, that cold, calculated dread, that neatly coiled rope, it felt too real, too deliberate. I never found out who or what was down there in those suffocating tunnels with me that night. But I learned my lesson the hard way. Some shortcuts aren't worth the time they save, or the price you might pay. And it's some of those old city stories, the ones you casually dismiss as just talk. Sometimes they're a lot closer to the goddamn truth than you think. I still get a shiver, a real physical shiver, when I pass over a subway grate in the sidewalk now, wondering what or who might be moving silently in the darkness just beneath my feet.